You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet.
Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. This episode is brought to you with the support of our brilliant sponsor X-Deep and the patrons of Speaking Sidemount. Huge thanks to both for their support, which makes all of this possible. When we look at the spectrum of sidemount diving and the applications that it's used for, we have everything from those of us that dive open water recreationally, who want to carry more gas and build redundancy into their equipment setup, through to technical diving and overheads such as wrecks and especially caves. For most of us, sidemount diving is a hobby, albeit one that can become a passion. For some, it's a career where they teach sidemount diving, and for the very few, it supports a calling to explore, for adventure, to go where no human has been before. Such a calling almost always involves great sacrifice, to commit financially, to locate yourself or travel to the right areas, to having the skills and training, and then building the experience to be able to deal with the barriers and, yes, the dangers that come with real exploration. Tom Crisp hails from my home, New Zealand, and is without doubt one of our finest cave explorers, and I'll use the term adventurers. Tom has based himself in Alberta, Canada, to allow him to discover and explore the caves of that region. You may recall Tom and I spoke way back in episode 15, and in this episode 75, we catch up on what we've been up to over the past 3.5 years. Tom talks about why he's based himself in Canada, his work and training with the Alberta Parks, and how this is supporting his exploration projects. Tom shares on how he shapes his life to support his exploration, the sacrifices and rewards that come from this calling. We chat about the active exploration projects Tom is working on in Canada and the geology of these caves before we talk at length on what it takes to dive in 2-degree water and access caves in sub-zero surface conditions. We cover Tom's sump diving setup before a really interesting exchange on knowing when to pull back when you encounter stressful situations on a dive. And we finish with Tom sharing on some of the cave exploration projects he had to leave behind and pass on to other explorers here in New Zealand. All this and much, much more in this episode of Speaking Sidemount.
All right, so let's get started. We are recording. Tom, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount.
Thanks, it's great to be back. Yeah, obviously been a few years. Yeah, lots happened since then.
Just to get started, how you been?
Yeah, good. Since last time, I kind of really focused on moving back to Canada because my heart was over here. And yeah, just with the caves and the cavers here, and just basically made the move back and been enjoying every second of it since. Definitely miss New Zealand as well. There's a lot of stuff going on that I would love to be a part of, but still equally excited to be here.
Yeah, amazing. And you say that your heart's in Canada. What is it about Alberta and Canada that has drawn you to that country?
Yeah, so I'm on the BC-Alberta border at the moment. So previously I was living just on the BC side, but now I'm actually over in Alberta. Yeah, one of my main reasons for loving it over here is because it's just, first of all, so different to New Zealand, but also very similar in a lot of ways as well. The people are amazing, and it's just such a vast expanse of land that the opportunities are just endless. If you feel like you kind of done everything in one area, then you just move a little bit further afield and you just keep doing that. And I mean, I've barely even scratched the surface. Yeah, it's just really nice to be in a refreshing kind of landscape. And New Zealand, I still love it over there. And that's also got a special place in my heart. But I think it was maybe feeling a little bit small after a while. So it's nice to have something else that I can kind of expand the horizons on.
Yeah, brilliant. Because I remember you mentioned it, us sitting around a table in my house back in 2018. And we talked a lot about how you got started in diving and your exploits here in New Zealand. And one thing you kindly shared your experiences on the KISS Sidekick, which was one of the early discussions that I was having along with people like Harry and a few others that led me to get onto the Sidewinder in 2019. So that was very much appreciated. We never got in the water with the Sidekick, but you and I did go and do a crappy little dive And
Oh, my
where was
home built
it?
side mount sub rig that I
That's
just
right.
designed. Yeah.
But it was awesome. And I mean, would you believe that episode was episode 15 and this one here is going to be episode 75?
Oh,
Clearly, a
wow.
fair bit of water's passed underneath both of us since then. So let's kick off. You mentioned where you are, but what are you actually up to now?
So currently for work, I've got a government job. I never thought I'd ever be saying that, but I'm working for Alberta Parks, and yeah, I'm basically in Canmore, mainly doing visitor information, just kind of like guiding tourists, selling like the conservation passes and things like that. But then there's a public safety component to it as well, where basically we're working with Kananaskis Emergency Services and deal with any injuries that happen in our particular area of the provincial park. That's a slightly smaller component of the job, but with the mountain bikers that are out here, then it's nice to kind of be able to help people out that are definitely in need of help in that particular moment. It's been great. They've put me through a bunch of training. It just seems to be endless what they're willing to kind of put me through in terms of courses and learning, and just a lot of support with the job. So yeah, enjoying that.
Yeah.
And then free time, I'm obviously just out there looking for new caves. We were actually just out on the weekend. So myself, my flatmate Jason Levine, who we alluded to in the last podcast we spoke as well, and then a couple of other buddies, and we were down in Fernie checking out some new caves, found some new potential as well. So that's mainly weekends consist of that: climbing, biking, anything outdoors really.
Yeah, it's quite amazing because I mean, when I look at your social media posts, I mean, I know you're an explorer, but the word adventurer comes to mind for me as well because yes, you're doing cave exploration, but I see posts of you snowboarding, mountaineering, and so on. How have you really shaped your life to be able to do the things that you do now?
Yeah, I get that question sometimes, and a lot of people also will ask, like, how do you afford this? How do you
Mhm.
get out and play in the mountains so much? And like a lot of these sports are expensive, and you got to get the training and all that sort of stuff. For me, it's actually been relatively straightforward. I've always found that if you want to do something, you can usually make it happen, but you
Mhm.
obviously have to make sacrifices in that. So if you look at my car, which is out in the drive at the moment, it's a crappy Ford Escort 2000. There's part of it that's held on with a ski strap at the moment. Like, my phone's pretty beaten up and cracked. Like, I don't have the latest and greatest. And some of those items that I would define as luxury, you take a bit of a hit on those and you invest what you can into what you love doing. So for me, that's putting more time, effort, and a lot of my money into experiences as opposed
Yeah.
to material things, which
Yeah.
has kind of led me down that path of being able to get out and do things on my days off. And also just moving to areas that, again, you might not necessarily be getting paid the most, but you're making a lifestyle choice. I'm working minimum wage jobs, but I'm in the middle of the mountains, and then the jobs usually come with other perks that kind of let you get outside and enjoy what you want to be doing. I'm never going
Yeah.
to be a
Yeah.
millionaire, but that's okay. I'm rich in spirit.
It's actually wealthy in other ways, as they say. And you were talking with me before we got online about some of the courses you're doing. And I know one of them was a mountaineering first aid course. I mean, that delivers straight into the sort of exploration and things you're doing as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's definitely worthwhile having. And it's pretty much one of the main certifications you need for working anything medical in the mountains or the backcountry. They call it the Advanced Wilderness First Aid. It's
Right.
basically taking like the occupational health and safety first aid training, but then putting it more in a backcountry setting
Hmm.
scenario. So if you were in a city, this is what you would do and this is what you're allowed to do. But in a backcountry setting, you might be out there for a lot longer. So we're going to give you some extra tools in the toolbox so that you can deal with problems, because help might be days away. For one instance on that, if someone breaks a femur, it's huge bone. You could have an internal bleeding, which wouldn't really be life-threatening if it was just a femur, but if it's combined with a lot of other things, it can get serious quite quick. And
Sure.
then if you throw the backcountry element into it as well, and you could be out there for days, you've got exposure to think about. There's also the pain as well that the patient's going to be dealing with. So they give you
Hmm.
a few extra tools, like being able to legally tension someone's leg so you can take a bit of pressure off of the injury as well. And it's just a really good course for that. They've put a lot of practical knowledge in there, and they kind of really tailor it to what we basically need it for when we're a little bit further away from help.
And you're doing some mountaineering work there as well?
I wouldn't say work, no. So again, my job's an office job at the moment. Once again, I never thought I'd ever do that, but it's
Hmm.
great. I'm surrounded by like-minded people, and they realised that none of us really want to be cooped up in an office. So they give us a lot of time to actually get out and play. Like even on work time today, if it wasn't raining, I could have gone out for a mountain bike while getting paid. It was raining, so I just went to the gym instead.
Fair
Yeah.
enough. So tell us about the caves that you're looking at now.
Yeah, so there's a lot of projects that are still going on since last time we spoke. Yeah, unfortunately, with COVID over the last year or so, and also work commitments and visas, and there's a few other things that have got in the way. Like, unfortunately, we couldn't be quite as active as we would have liked to, but a lot of those projects are still ongoing. There's one that we're planning on heading back to shortly called the Looking Glass. And
Hmm.
that's one of my favorite caves. It's this beautiful white marble. I would love to make a countertop out of that marble. It's stunning. It's like got
Yeah.
this tiger banding through it as well, and it's middle of nowhere, kind of north of Revelstoke. It's a real pain to get to. So we've actually built like a 4x4 track up there. It's about 70 kilometers on forestry roads, so like pretty rough
Hmm.
roads. And then you
Hmm.
get to an area where you're close to the cave, but still not close enough that you want to start hauling gear. And the
Hmm.
road has washed out, or the old logging road has. So we've had to build like a 4x4 track around there so we can actually get access to the campsite and then start hiking up to the cave. So we got to go back in a couple of weeks and do some work on the road. And then September, when the water levels drop, I think we're going to head back into Looking Glass, and we're up to about Sump 3 now. And we're expecting that to keep going. There's a restriction that's been hit with a lot of water flow coming out. It might be a bit of groveling to get into that and kind of pulling against the current, but once we're past that restriction, it'll open back up into nice passage. So that's one that's happening soon. And then I think October time, there's another cave that we were diving called Raspberry Rising, which is in Rogers Pass.
Hmm.
And we may have spoken about that briefly, but that's a very short dive to get into. Last time I was in there was in winter, and yeah, it was pretty cold outside, like maybe -20, and very short dive to get into. And then you end up climbing a pretty big waterfall underwater. I think it's like 5 pitches on rope. And then you spend the rest of the day basically walking your way up through the inside of the mountain, and then you get to a series of sumps at the back. And
Hmm.
there's a few other dry leads that we looked at when I was in there last, and unfortunately they kind of like fizzled out. So at the end of Sump 5, there's a restriction that I personally haven't seen. I've just heard reports of. So I think this year I'm going to get in, go have a look and see if that restriction is going to be passable or not. Another
Right.
project there, and
Yep.
then other stuff going on. I've been diving in Cast Spring, which I think we spoke about last time as well, which is a really, really interesting cave. I have absolute love-hate relationship with that cave. It doesn't want to give up its secrets easily. So last winter, I did a few dives and managed to extend the cave past Martin Grove's old line and get further in, which is still pretty deep. Unfortunately, at that stage, I only had air as well, so I decided to turn around because narcosis
Hmm.
levels and all that sort of stuff. But
Yep.
that's a no mount restriction to get in. And then you're in like this breakdown section for the first 50 meters or so. And it's all very loose and kind of quite sketchy. And then eventually you pop out into like more open passage, but there's still big slabs that have fallen out the roof. And then when you get
Hmm.
down to about 40 meters depth, it actually turns into proper tunnel, as it were. Last winter we were there, tried to go back this winter with Trimix on the rebreather again, and
Hmm.
we hauled everything up there, and the entrance had collapsed in on itself. Yeah, very unstable boulder pile in the entrance. When Harry and Craig were over, actually, when we were diving in Crow's Nest Spring, we went up there and did a little bit of, I think the PC term is gardening in the entrance,
Hmm. Hmm.
just to kind of move some stuff so we could actually squeeze through. And like I said, it's all collapsed in now. So I'm glad I was on the right side of that collapse.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, there must be some kind of thought process where you make decisions around whether you want to go into a cave like that. I remember talking to somebody, it might have been Michael Thomas, about some of the cave exploration that he's been involved in and hitting rock piles and those sort of things where there's cave collapse possible. Certainly as scary as hell, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the main reason I think that cave collapsed was because of the summer floods. It felt stable enough, when I was in there. And we also kind of like wedged rocks in to make sure it was a little bit more stable when I was actually in there. But I mean, it's always in the back of your mind. Yeah, especially in those no mount situations as well, because you've got such a small gap to get through this breakdown in the first place that if anything small even blocks that in, then yeah, it's definitely something that that needs to be considered. Yeah, so there's
Yeah.
that. And then I guess probably the last big one that's been on the list and kind of been dived already would be Castle Guard. That was a pretty big trip, and that was just before COVID kicked off. So
And that was the one with Harry and Craig I saw the video on, is that right?
yeah. So they
Yeah.
originally came over, I think it was 2016, may have been 2017 when I was over here last time. And we were diving Crow's Nest Spring, which again we spoke about in the last podcast, which is the one which does like a real sawtooth profile. Yeah, during that trip, my flatmate basically asked Harry and Craig and said, "Look, do you guys want to come over and do Castle Guard?" And the initial response was, "No, we're not doing that. That's way too hard." And then kind of by the end of the trip, they'd warmed to the idea and were like, "You know what? When are we coming back for Castle Guard?" So Harry actually did a lot of the organizing with a lady called Katie Graham to get the expedition underway. And yeah, it was 2020 in March when we all came over for that. And it was 16 people for 2 weeks, basically camping in minus 25, and huge effort to put just 2 people in the water for basically one dive. It was a successful trip, but then of course we emerged and found out that COVID was a thing. So yeah, very very
Crazy.
entertaining trip. Yeah.
Isn't it just, how the world has changed? Well, actually, it's changed a lot, but I guess now that we're opening up again, we're starting to be able to experience some of the things we did before. And
It looks like you guys managed to get over to Mount Gambier.
yeah, it was because we're at a completely different, I won't say end of the spectrum, but we're in a completely different type of cave diving to what you're talking about, of course. And the beauty of what we're trying to do there is that we took an initial trip over in 2019 and just had a ball. We were really well looked after. I got to catch up with Ryan Ketchkowski and some of the guys over there. And I got the opportunity to do the advanced cave crossover and then go and dive tank. And that's my kind of cave where you rock up in your truck and there's a change facility there and you get changed and there's a cave map. You might have a little bit of a ladder to climb down and then you're in the water and then you're cave diving. And of course, we're not talking about going through sumps or any dry caving either. But the idea is really to train some more Kiwi cave divers as well, because our opportunities to train here are really limited, as I'm sure you know. And we've got a lot of great divers, 100-meter rebreather divers and so on. But the opportunity to be able to do some serious overhead diving is quite limited. So Mount Gambier is just great for us. And we're about to run our second trip in September, and we'll keep these going. And hopefully we start to build some people who catch on to it. And whether they become a cave diver like me, I call myself a holiday cave diver. So, I'll go on holidays to Mount Gambier and Mexico and Europe and other parts of the world and dive some just absolutely stellar caves, or whether they want to take it in a different direction and follow your sort of path where they want to explore and find new cave and new cave passage. And all of those opportunities open up with getting the first steps towards cave training done. So
yeah, it's great that Kiwis have the opportunity to do that so close to home now as well. Sure, the opportunity was there for me when I was living in New Zealand, but it also kind of felt like I had to go further afield as well to get more training in. Yeah, I ended up doing mine in Mexico, but now it's becoming more accessible for Kiwis just to hop across to Australia and go and do that. I think that's great.
And then, of course, there are the opportunities to dive caves in New Zealand. They're just much tougher and they're colder. And we're going to talk some more about all of these things because, as I said, it's not like the holiday cave diving when you drive up in your truck and there's the entrance and there's a permanent line being put in. This is going to be good for both New Zealand cave diving and also for those who want to dive overseas and experience some of the caves, some of the more prominent places, Mexico, Florida, Europe, and so on. Let's carry on a bit. We talked a little bit about what you're doing in the caves you're going into. I'm interested in a little bit on the geology of those caves too, because you mentioned the word karst in the name of one of them. I missed the full name. So what's the nature of the geology around the caves that you're diving?
I'm definitely not the most knowledgeable person on this. I get a lot of information from other people that are around. So Karst Spring, which I think is the cave you were talking about just before, basically helping a lady called Sarah Lilly do her thesis paper because she's studying Karst Spring and the hydrology around the area. And previously, it wasn't really known where that water source was or where any of that water was coming from. But she's done a lot of research like dye tracing and like theoretical science, trying to figure out exactly what was feeding the spring. And again, Canada, the entire landscape in Western Canada where we are, it's all mountains. So it's all folded up. You've got mountains that are being caused by like thrusting that's happening in the tectonic plates. So effectively, most of the caves that we're diving here are in fault lines. So basically, we're just following these fault lines and water's doing the same thing. In particular, Karst Spring, what's happening there is you've got what's called a syncline, where there's kind of almost, if you imagine like a drain pipe, where it's like a U shape, and then you raise the drain pipe on one side, as you would do for like guttering of a house. So you've got this impermeable layer that water will basically run down until the lowest point. Now, if you put mountains on top of that, is effectively what we've got going on at Karst Spring. So you've got this limestone, this porous rock, which is sat on top of an impermeable layer, which is like a cup shape that then heads down on an angle. So you've got this huge area within that drain pipe that is catching water, and it's all being funneled down to the lowest point of that. And then that's where it emerges as Karst Spring. So that one in particular is pretty interesting. We have other caves which are very different. Castleguard, for instance, that cave runs underneath Mount Castleguard, funnily enough, but the far end of like the main dry caving area, the glacier is being pushed into it. So normally thousands of years ago when the glacier wasn't there, it probably would have been open to the air. And then since then, the glaciers have formed and they've been pushed into the cave. And then where we're actually diving in Castleguard is an offshoot, which heads up a completely different valley. And that water is quite clearly being fed from the Saskatchewan Glacier or surrounding Columbia Glacier. We still haven't quite figured out exactly where it's coming from, but we've got a good idea. And that's similar kind of thing. The water's eroding out these fault lines and these little fractures and turning them into larger caves. So again, that one's quite geologically different. And then the other one, which is probably even more geologically different as well, and we have no idea where the water comes from, is Crow's Nest Spring, where Harry and Craig were diving with me a number of years ago. And that is known as a warm cave because the water is a constant 6 degrees, whereas most of the other stuff around here tends to be between kind of 2 and 4 degrees. Right. Yeah, that water is theorized to be coming from quite deep in the earth, as opposed to a lot of these other ones, which would be relatively shallow in comparison. And when we say relatively shallow, we're not talking, like 5 or 6 meters. It could still be coming from like 100 meters or so, 200 meters depth. But geologically speaking, that's a lot shallower than if it's coming from a kilometer deep.
And I'm assuming in these caves, they haven't been through some of the periods that we see in other caves where they have formations where they've been dry and wet in different phases, and you have formations, stalactites, stalagmites, and so on.
No, not at all. We do see formations in the dry caves because obviously that's where they form. But any of the underwater stuff here, it's all basically phreatic. So it's never been dry at any stage. Yeah, unfortunately, no pretty formations other than the ones that you get forming in completely wet caves.
And all of them are beautiful. I mean, it's great to look at formations, but I mean, you look at caves that I dive like Tank, for instance. Tank really doesn't have a large amount of formations at all, but it's still really beautiful. And as you mentioned before about some of the marble and so on that you can see in caves, it's just equally beautiful. It's just different.
Yeah, you kind of find every cave has a personality, as it were. They're all just completely unique. I know a lot of people who are wreck divers will probably say, oh, it's just wet rock, but it's not just kind of what you're looking at when you're doing a lot of these dives. It's also, I would say, the approach as well. What have you got to do to actually get there is kind of what dictates what mindset you're in before you actually enter the water. And it kind of gives you like a personal feeling before you actually enter the cave. So you kind of get these different feels for different caves. And some of them are, big, beautiful, open things that you just cruise down. And then others are small and tight and a bit more foreboding. And you could have some which are dark, which, just like eat your light. So, you got this really
black
powerful
walls.
light, but if you got black walls, you can't see very far. And then vice versa, you could have like beautiful white marble as well. So yeah, they're all really unique. And I think just because of lack of formations doesn't mean they're not pretty in any way.
So, Tom, you mentioned 6 degrees being warm and then 4 to 2 being cold. And clearly, it's mighty cold in Canada. And I know you've done some very cold water diving here in New Zealand as well. And I know from my point of view, cold water is anything under 10, but clearly, there's a lot of factors that go into diving really cold water. So, let's chat for a bit on what it takes to dive when the temperatures get under 10. And then what do you need to do as you go down to 6 into 4 into 2 as you're approaching 0?
Yeah, it's probably one of my main concerns with cave diving over here is the temperature. And it tends to be my limiting factor at the moment. Most of my dives are turned more based on how I'm feeling thermally as opposed to what gas limitations I've got, especially with rebreathers these days, because
Mm-hmm.
as you know, they're just so efficient. As long as you're making sure you got enough bailout gas, then you usually don't have an issue being in the water for so long. But over here, it's a little bit tricky, particularly if the caves are going deep, because of course your decompression time racks up. So
Yeah.
you kind of have to have almost this number in the back of your head, which is thermally, I know I can stay in the water for 2 hours or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is. So you need to obviously be keeping an eye on your decompression times and also your penetration times to be able to hit that 2 hour mark and then still be able to safely decompress within that and also swim back out the cave depending on whichever one comes first. But
Mm-hmm.
as the caves kind of become deeper, that becomes slightly more complex as well, because of course, if you're at depth swimming into a cave, racking up decompression, then you have to consider that in the deeper portion of that cave, you're also going to have to be swimming back out, still racking up decompression. So you have
Mm-hmm.
to bear that in mind, because then you're still going to have to sit in the water. Yeah, fortunately, these days undergarments have come along in leaps and bounds. Fourth Element in particular have been kind enough to support me.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, a lot of what I'm dealing with thermally is kind of thanks to them. I know their Halo has been just groundbreaking for me. That combined with their X Core as well has meant that I've
Mm-hmm.
kind of shied away from the heated undergarments,
Mm-hmm.
which I used for a little while, because first of all, you've got to carry around battery packs, so then you've got to think about the burn times on those. Whereas now with the X Core and the Halo kind of combined, like personally for me, I just find that works. It means that I'm not concerned with a battery dying or a cable failing or something like that. So I should be thermally sound while I've got that kind of combination of undergarments on. But yeah, like you said, between 2 and 4 degrees is pretty standard for over here. I think the coldest I got in New Zealand was in the Pierce Resurgence in Blue Creek, which was about 6 degrees. And at the time, that felt cold. But now coming over here, it's 2 degrees, definitely feels chilly. The issue we also have here in Canada is the caves are basically in flood during the summer seasons. Most other places that have resurgence style caves like we do, you get precipitation up high in the mountains or in the hills, wherever the water
Mm-hmm.
source is, trickles down through the mountains and then comes out at the spring. So usually if you get rainfall, that's what's affecting the cave. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
here in Canada, the majority of the precipitation is actually snow. So in winter, all of that water is held high up in the mountain as snow and it's not running through the cave. So
Mm-hmm.
the actual dive season over here runs from late autumn or fall, if you're here in North America, all
Mm-hmm.
the way through winter until spring when the caves flood.
Yeah.
So that in itself adds a few thermal challenges as well, because you'll go for a dive, and I'll use Car Spring as an example. Last time I was in there, I think it was only about -15 or -20. It wasn't bitterly cold like we do get over here. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, that's cold, but you kind of get used to that after a while, like those kind of surface air temperatures. Whereas
Yeah.
-30 over here is when you're getting pretty cold.
Mm-hmm.
So to go and do a dive in 2 degree water actually feels like you're jumping in a bathtub,
Right.
which is crazy because, at 2 degrees, you wouldn't ever think of that as being warm. But when it's -20 outside, you're warmer getting in for the dive. And then you kind of slowly, your core temperature starts dropping. You finish the dive and then you emerge to -20 and you get even colder again.
Which
So,
must be terrible for decompression as well, where, at the end of the dive, all of a sudden you've got vasoconstriction happening and
yeah, exactly. And the other thing we also have here as well is we're at altitude. There's no way around that. I mean, a lot of the caves we're diving here are probably about 1,500 meters above sea level. So I think
Right.
right now where I am, if I turn my Shearwater on, you know how it tells you what your PO2 is, like even if you've just got air plugged in. Mine
Yeah.
says I'm basically breathing 17% at the moment.
Right.
So effectively we're ascending into a vacuum. So that's another factor which kind of has to be taken into consideration. So there's a lot going on, but the thermal side of things is pretty much my main concern at the moment. Again, because when you surface, your core temperature's dropped drastically and you're ascending into -20 sometimes. And we're all divers. We know what happens when you take your mask off. You get the boogers that are coming out. And you go to wash your
They
face with the
freeze.
water from the cave and your eyelids freeze shut.
Yeah.
So it's, yeah.
It's just stunning. It's just stunning. Yeah, I did an episode way back with Mikatulia in Sweden, and they were diving Burelven. I hope I've got the pronunciation right. And it was exactly the same scenario. Their dive season's winter, and they're taking snowmobiles into the wilderness, and that in itself was quite dangerous for them. That was, he thought, the most dangerous part of the expedition. And then they get to the cave and they're chainsawing through ice on the top of a pond, and then in they go. And the reason is solely because of flow. In summer, you simply can't pass the flow. That's all there is to it.
Sounds very, very similar to over here. And I've been following that project for quite a while now. I think since the days when it was called, I think it used to be called the Invisible River. And I remember seeing a video of someone squeezing through that gravel restriction in the entrance. And yeah, that's a beautiful cave. And it looks very similar to some of the stuff that we have over here. And, logistics wise, similar again. You got the snow to deal with. And like he said, probably the most dangerous part was the approach to the cave. And that's similar with stuff here in Canada. We're crossing avalanche paths or in the backcountry, and, things go wrong in winter. It's a lot harder for people to get to you than it is in summer. So yeah, they've got a really cool project going on there.
Yeah, very much so. And I think the Swedes and some of the other Scandinavian countries have really dialed into this cold water diving as well. I was talking to Sana Volja in the last episode, and she was talking about getting the lessons from some of her Swedish friends and the cavettes around layering. And she was talking about dealing with the difference between 8 Celsius and going down to 4 and 2, which she thought was quite a large change. And I imagine it is. And so, yeah, having the right undergarments, dry gloves. She was talking about wrist seals as well, and making sure there's nothing touching your skin. I imagine your neck seals and what you've got happening around your face is really important as well. So
yeah, it's the same as any kind of diving as well, when it just comes down to experience. I mean, when you first get out of open water and the equipment still feels kind of alien to you because you're still figuring it out, and then you get comfortable with that, you start adding something else. It's the same with dry suit diving and thick undergarments. You
dry
are a lot
gloves.
more bulky. Dry gloves, yeah, you've got a lot more restricted movements. You kind of get used to what you're capable of doing in that equipment and kind of how you need to be maneuvering. And for instance, just manipulating bolt snaps. It's a different technique, but it's something that you just get used to with experience. I guess if you need to do it, just put the hard yards in and,
exactly.
jump into
And
cold
again,
water.
back to some of the lessons that we've learned through Speaking Sidemount as well. I mean, one of the things you do is you get the experience on dives that are relatively benign compared to where you're going to go as well, right? So you're building them up in an environment that isn't perhaps as challenging, so that you can then take it further when you feel you've got it nailed and dialed in.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. You don't want to be testing out new equipment in somewhere that's pretty high consequence. That's for sure.
Yeah. So let's talk some more about your equipment setup, because you're talking about doing sump diving as well, which typically requires some element of climbing gear and other things as well. I'm assuming you're diving open circuit and also rebreather depending on the dive. Let's talk about harnesses and cylinders and regulators. How have you got that all together so that it supports what you're doing?
Yeah, one thing which I'm using quite a lot at the moment, which you saw actually last time when we first dived together, was that kind of sump system that I wouldn't say personally developed. I stole a lot of ideas from other people. I think Andy Goring from Sump UK kind of gave me some inspiration, and then a bunch of the other sump divers as well. I took bits and pieces from their equipment and kind of tweaked it to how I felt would work. And I've basically come up with a system that works for me for open circuit, and I've used it closed circuit as well. And it's been very lovingly nicknamed the Smul, the super mega ultra lightweight,
Love it.
because it's effectively a weight belt, piece of bungee, and a couple of drop D rings on that weight belt. So yeah, I've used it very successfully over in New Zealand for doing some sump stuff over there, where I can fit literally all of my equipment in a caving pack, including cylinders and wetsuit. And the way you pack it actually makes it really good. And then the bladder clips around the outside. So if you're swimming across a sump pool, you can inflate it, or your equipment floats on the surface and you just push it in front of you. So it was great for that, like open circuit wetsuit diving. And then probably one of the bigger dives I actually did on that system was Castle Guard. There's a lot of crawling, so it was just made sense to take something that was lightweight. I made it work with my Sidekick rebreather, and then unfortunately my rebreather was actually damaged on the way in, so I ended up having to use a chest mount unit instead, and it worked with that. So it was a very versatile little unit. I mean, obviously it does come with its limitations, but for kind of the applications we're using it for here, it's very lightweight, very cost effective, and yeah, it just seems to do what we need, and it's very tough as well. It's very easy to carry spares. So to kind of describe it to you effectively, it's the weight belt, as I said before, with two D-rings that drop down kind of almost like your butt plate. And then the top half of it, there's actually nothing rigid on it. It's just a piece of bungee, which kind of crosses over your shoulder and then comes underneath your arms, and it kind of forms like an X around the top of your shoulders. And that allows you to bungee your cylinders around. And I've got knots tied in certain places, so you can clip bolt snaps off to it and they don't slide around anywhere. They kind of stay where they need to on the bungee. Yeah, that's been great because you can also use it in conjunction with SRT gear. So if we got to ascend ropes or descend ropes, then I can actually swap the waist belt, like the weight belt. I can swap that out for my SRT harness. And there's these adapters that you can use for lead weights where it's like a bungee and like a plastic plate. You can effectively put weight on any 2-inch webbing. And of course, our SRT harnesses are 2-inch webbing as well. So you can dive in your SRT harness with just the bungee on top for clipping your tanks off, and then the bladder for inflation if you're diving wetsuit. You don't always need it if you're diving dry suit. That just kind of clips on over the top like the X-Deep Classic. So yeah, just been plugging away with that, and it's kind of done everything that I need, and haven't really made any tweaks to it recently.
Brilliant. I'm always very interested in different equipment for configurations, and particularly when you're getting in and out of the water, I think it makes a massive difference to what you need to have. And clearly, if you have to push through massive restrictions on the way in and out as well, although my gear will do that, it's really the matter of then what do you do if you have to do a climb or you've got to do a long walk and so on. Interesting. Cool. So one thing that stuck with me from our last conversation was you're talking about you made some decisions when you were diving with Harry and Craig a few years ago to call a dive when you felt like you'd hit up against the equipment and skills and experience that you had at the time. And obviously these situations can vary depending on where you are in your dive career and the particular dives you're doing. But I think we're really starting to talk a bit about the mental side of dealing with push dives and dives that potentially are stressful or are starting to really butt up against, whether it's your depth limits, your decompression limits, your comfort zone inside a cave and so on. Tell us a bit about how you deal with that when you're going into what is genuine new cave that you've never seen before. And one thing that always goes through my mind is pushing through a restriction that nobody's ever been through before. And I'm quite happy to go through them when some guy's been before me. So tell us how you deal with that.
Yeah, it's definitely a bit of a mind game. There's a lot of factors that come into play, you know, with emotions, and you feel like there's so much time and effort and resources that have gone into getting somewhere that you feel that you have to perform. So you've got that kind of pressure that's always in the background. But I think overriding that, you've always just got to have this kind of sense of self-preservation. Like if you're not happy, if you're not 100% on that dive, if you're not feeling the most optimistic about it, or if things just feeling wrong, then you have to turn around, and you just kind of have to listen to that gut feeling of yours versus letting peer pressure sneak into things. And it's really sad to say at the moment, but there's so much peer pressure coming from social media as well. Like you feel you have to be doing crazy stuff so that you can be posting things and, you know, getting that kind of recognition. You need to let all of that go, and you need to be basically doing this kind of diving for the right reasons. So for me, I've never really found it an issue to back away from a dive or be on a dive and say, you know what, today's not the day, because the cave's always going to be there. You can always go back. Yeah, just one of those things, and you need to listen to yourself and know yourself as well. That's pretty much all the advice I could really
Totally.
give.
And also, I think you mentioned a couple of things there, but one other thing that comes into it is ego. And maybe that's what you were alluding to when you were talking about social media, is wanting other people to see you doing dives and also wanting to be like someone else. Let's say people want to be like you, for instance. I can imagine that sort of thing as a driver for some people. And I've got my own experience when I was in Mount Gambier. I had the great fortune to dive with Josh Richards there. He's just a champion human being. He's the owner of the Habby. I did a checkout dive in Ewan's Ponds. The main reason for me wanting to do that is I hadn't had the Sidewinder in the water for 9 months. And I'd been doing all open circuit diving for that period. And there was a whole variety of reasons for that, some to do with COVID and some to do with some repairs I needed to do on it. But the net of it was that it was just back to the situation again where I had what was effectively a piece of equipment that I was out of practice on. Already had 100 hours or so, but that's not that much. So I got into Ewan's Ponds and did a dive and sorted everything out, and it went great. There was no issues whatsoever. Bailed out, did a few other drills, everything was fine. Then we went to the Pines Cave and dived the Pines, and I'm a good diver and I'm a cave diver. And so he started to take me through some of the cave sections of the Pines, and we went through a couple of restrictions where the visibility dropped dramatically and we needed to turn on our sides and wiggle our way through a little bit. And I was starting to feel a little uneasy at that point. So we did that dive, we turned around, came back, and I can remember thinking at that point, I hope we're not going too much further. Quite happy with what I've done here. I want to go back. And we did. We came back through and got through that okay. And then I'd actually made a mistake putting my gear on. I'd forgotten to do my gaiters up on my dry suit. I've got fitted boots. So I was getting a bit of gas into my feet, but it wasn't a big problem. Then he took me through another restriction. I think it's called the TV or something like that.
Oh, the
But anyhow,
TV
we went
room. Yeah.
TV room, right. It's not a tough one, but you do have to turn. It's a little bit vertical and you have to turn on to a 45-degree angle to be able to fit through unless you're going to take gear off, which you don't need to. Anyhow, as I'm going through that, my feet are floating up behind me and jamming me up against the rock as I'm trying to pull through a restriction that I don't really know and I can sort of only partly see. And I was thinking, yeah, nah, I know I can get through here and Josh is already on the other side. But I just said, hey, dude, let's turn around. I swam him back to the tree stump and I swam up to the surface and fixed my problem and then came back again. And the bottom line was, on that particular day, my first cave dive for quite some time, having just done a checkout dive, on my second dive on the Sidewinder after 9 months, I wasn't comfortable. Now, at the end of the trip, having said that I didn't make the mistake with my gear getting in as well, I would have been absolutely fine doing that restriction. I'd love to go back and have another go at it. But on that particular day, it was a no-go. And it was just, I've already got a problem. I don't need to create 2 or 3 other problems trying to squeeze through something that, what's the win to me?
Yeah, exactly. You've got to look at every single dive and every situation as it appears in front of you. So, like you said, that particular day wasn't the day you were going through that restriction, but if you went back next time, you'd probably be feeling a lot better. And the cave's going to be there, so you may as well just wait. If you're faced with those tough decisions and you're not feeling it, then take your time and go back later.
Yeah, and look, many accidents and near accidents have been caused by pushing past that particular point that we're just talking about. So yeah, thank you for sharing. So Tom, what's coming up for you over the coming months? And you mentioned the expeditions. Are we going to see you back in New Zealand? Is that possible?
Potentially, yeah. I'm currently working on staying over here for a little bit longer. I've just got an application in process for another couple-year visa, so I'm going to try and make that work if I can, just because there's so many unfinished leads and projects over here that I just want to carry on with. And yeah, that's obviously the case in New Zealand as well. When I left, there was a bunch of projects over there as well, but I could be back very soon, or it might be another couple of years. I really don't know at the moment, but either way, I think I'm going to be pretty happy, just because there's always things to be doing.
Because I know back in New Zealand, I'm catching up with Bruce Clulow, who I know you've dived with a bit, in a couple of months or so to do an interview for Speaking Sidemount. And we're going to talk a little bit about the South Pacific and the Cook Islands. And I know we'll get on to New Zealand cave diving as well. And you've been responsible for opening up just truckloads of caves and cave passage in New Zealand. And I know you and Bruce were collaborated on Cottage and Totra some years ago. Tell us a little bit about some of the work that you did in New Zealand. Now that you've gone, you've kindly passed on to other divers to continue the exploration.
Yeah, so there was a number of areas in New Zealand that we had been exploring, mainly over on the West Coast, and kind of have another guy, Kieran Mackay, to thank for that as well. He kind of introduced me to the area, and it's just so fruitful with projects, and some of my favorite caves I've ever dived have been over there. And again, with those boys, Bruce and Mike, so that's Bruce Clulow, Mike Beatty, and Guy as well. We just did project after project, and we're finding new cave all the time. And yeah, it was kind of hard, I guess, for me walking away from that because, I realized I was going to be over here for a while and definitely wasn't going to be the kind of person that puts a gate over a cave and says, no, you guys can't dive there because, I've still got active exploration going on in there, when the reality is I'm not going to be in the country. So I kind of handed them the keys and said, go and do what you will and make sure you produce some maps and some good data and good luck with it. There was a number of caves, probably the one which, I got a lot of FOMO when they went back to was a cave called DBS, which Mike Beatty and I were down on the West Coast. I had my 30th birthday down there. And the day before my 30th birthday, Mike and I went out bush bashing and we went our separate ways just to cover a bit more ground. And I basically followed this stream that I found and it led up to just a beautiful cave entrance. And the reason we called it DBS is because it stands for double barrel shotgun, because it's two parallel passages that just run into the side of the hill, kind of like swimming down the barrel of a shotgun. Yeah, that cave took my breath away. Literally first ever dive that was done in there. I did on my 30th birthday. We hauled some tanks in, actually managed to take a little train most of the way because the local caving company was kind enough to lend us that, and basically did a dive, and it was just nice flow, big open passage, swimming passage, and just dumping line in there, and you swim down this barrel, you kind of turn to the right, opens up into a bit of a room, and then it goes into another room. And when I say room, like my light wouldn't see the other side. These rooms were huge. And I kept swimming, and at some points, like route finding was a little bit difficult. So I was actually kind of wafting the sand and silt and seeing which direction the flow was coming from and just kind of pointing my nose into it and swimming that direction. And eventually I kind of swam over the edge of this ledge and this massive shaft just disappeared below me. I've still got the video and I actually screamed through my rig. I'm not going to say what I said, but yeah, it was definitely screams of excitement and of this shaft just dropping down. And we hadn't seen anything like that in the area. Most of the caves had been fairly shallow. And I was already at, I think, around 12 meters at that stage. And this shaft just appeared to head off into oblivion below me. With that, I actually turned around and headed back out because I did think to myself, I was like, I could go down there, but it'd be best to kind of share this with someone else and share the excitement. So I actually went back out and waited for Mike to be able to dive as well before we actually descended the shaft together. So yeah, there's definitely projects like that I kind of miss in New Zealand, and kind of handing those projects off to other people was a little bit tough, but I mean, they've been doing some great work in there, been exploring some amazing cave, and I guess in the long term gives me more of the drive that if I do come back to New Zealand, sure, I'm going to go for a few dives in those caves and probably help them out now, because it's probably more their project. They know what the cave's doing and what's required to get to the end. So, I'll be following them instead of vice versa. And then just gives me the drive to, I guess, go out and look for other new projects as well. So it's
brilliant.
Yeah, exciting times over there.
We talked about ego before. I mean, you have to be a little bit humble in handing off like that. I'm sure everyone appreciates that. And there's no point having bad blood about these things as well. It just is what it is, isn't it?
Yeah. No, we're all just passionate divers. We all just want to get out and go diving. And, with the exploration side of things, we all want to be exploring. So, yeah, hopefully I'd like to think that, I've handed off a few things, and if the tables were turned, I would like to think that it happened the opposite direction. And indeed, I definitely have seen it as well. So I think what goes around definitely comes around. Treat people how you want to be treated, and eventually it'll come back around.
Obviously, you don't want to be jumping them if you're still actively on them, but often people have to stop for a variety of reasons. And
to a certain degree as well, you also have to respect, like, if someone is actively exploring something, that you don't just go and scoop it from them.
Totally.
And then kind of, blast it out there on social media that you did this amazing dive, when the reality is most of the hard work was done by someone else. You definitely don't want to be doing that. But I think the more we can be open about what kind of leads we've got and talk about what projects are going on, then I think that's better long term, because then we have more of an understanding of what's out there and what's available.
As you and I talked about before too, I mean, there's a lot of really prominent caves are being re-explored. I'm thinking of Jenny Springs, and I'm thinking of some of the ones in the Bahamas as well, where There's several lifetimes of exploration to be done in these caves. And it's really, even if someone else takes it over for a time, there's always an opportunity to come back if you're able to, right?
Yeah, always another time. And as
Yeah.
technology gets better as well, it gives us longer ranges and bigger lights so we can see more leads. And
Yeah. Are we in an amazing time technology-wise? I mean, certainly rebreathers are definitely becoming much more of a player in just about every diver. I wonder how much of it is the price of helium now as well, but because certainly open circuit trimix is not a good deal for anybody at the moment, but they're just changing the game in terms of duration and depth and decompression profiles. As Ed Sorensen used to hammer into me, gas stress, distance stress, time stress, a lot of that's gone. You're really able to push dives that were very difficult in the past.
yeah, it's definitely an exciting time. Rebreathers, undergarments, dive lights, everything just keeps getting more and more refined in a good way.
Yeah, sure. I just took a Big Blue VTL, I think it's called 10,000, to Mount Gambier. It's just basically a light on your wrist, no cables anymore. Oh my God, how good was that light?
Well, you think about that, and then you think about the pioneers like Shaq Exley and those guys back in the day who, effectively just had a candle in a jam jar and just went for it.
Yeah, amazing. We stand on the shoulders of giants for sure. And yet there's still awesome things to be done. Well, mate, I think we've covered a lot of really, really good ground, Tom, and it's been awesome to catch up with you again and see your face. Your beard is going extremely well, mate. So you're definitely a Canadian mountain man now.
Oh, I've had this for years now. I think even before I moved to Canada the first time, but good catching up as well.
Yeah, and if you get back to NZ, make sure you look me up. We'll try and go on a decent dive next time. Maybe even you can drag me down south or something. We'll see. And just for those who were listening earlier, the West Coast is a region of New Zealand, but it's the West Coast of the South Island. And it's an old gold mining area as well.
Rough and rugged.
Rough and rugged. People. Very special people come from there. It's the wettest part of the country. They cop a lot of rainfall, but a brilliant place. I've got many happy memories from visiting there with friends who are from there in particular. Brilliant. Well, cheers again, Tom, and all the best, mate. And good luck with your exploration now that you're able to get back into it.
Yeah, cheers. Great chatting to you again. And I'm sure we'll keep you guys posted with anything that goes on over here.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Cheers. Bye.
Hey, thanks so much for joining me on this episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did catching up with Tom. It was awesome to hear what he's been up to over the past 3.5 years. I was particularly interested in this episode to uncover what it takes to be an explorer and an adventurer, and I was interested in the sacrifices and also the rewards that Tom has gained by choosing this lifestyle. We went through Tom's sump setup, which was awesome, and then to be able to learn more about the caves of Canada was just phenomenal, and in particular, what it takes to dive in really, really cold water. Thanks again to Tom. Thank you so much to X-Deep for supporting this project, and also to the patrons of Speaking Sidemount, who combined make everything you've just listened to possible. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you in the next episode. You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.